It's hard to find the right words for something so basic, so fundamental, that we barely notice it. It's about what exists and how we think about it. Simply put, it's about reality itself. To understand this, we need a bit of context. The way we see the world as Westerners living in the United States didn't appear out of nowhere. It's shaped by ideas that have traveled through history. These ideas are woven into our language, our logic, and even into what we consider reasonable or true. They influence our daily thinking more than we usually realize, often in ways we don't stop to question. I call these basic ideas myths, but I don't mean myths as false stories. Instead, I mean myths as powerful frameworks, images or metaphors, that help us make sense of the world. For instance, if you're explaining electricity to someone, you might compare it to water. You might say electricity flows like a river, calling it an electric current. Now, electricity isn't water, but this metaphor helps us understand it because electricity and water share some similar behaviors. Or take astronomy. To explain the concept of an expanding universe, scientists might use the example of a balloon. Imagine a black balloon with white dots on it. The dots represent galaxies. As you blow up the balloon, the dots spread farther apart, like galaxies in the universe. Of course, the actual universe isn't a balloon, but this analogy makes the idea easier to grasp. In the same way, we rely on these kinds of images to understand our world. Right now, though, the dominant images we live by are outdated. They come from older scientific or cultural ideas and no longer fit with what we now know. One of the big challenges we face is finding a new image of the world, one that makes sense and feels satisfying in light of today's knowledge. That's what I want to talk about. Not just the image itself, but how we can align our feelings and perceptions with it, so it truly makes sense to us. For thousands of years, we've been working with two main models of the universe. The first is what they call the ceramic model, and the second is the fully automatic model. The ceramic model comes from the Book of Genesis and forms the basis of the worldviews in Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. It's a deeply influential way of seeing the universe. In the Book of Genesis, the image of the world is like an artifact, a creation made by a skilled craftsman. It's similar to how a potter shapes clay into pots, or a carpenter builds furniture out of wood. This image of God portrays him as a technician, a craftsman with a specific plan, who shapes the universe according to his design. This fits with the idea of Jesus being both a carpenter's son and the Son of God, reinforcing the idea of God as a divine creator working with raw materials. At the heart of this view is the belief that the world is made of stuff, a kind of raw, lifeless material, like clay in the hands of a potter. This stuff has no intelligence or life of its own. It needs an external force, an external intelligence, to shape it and bring it to life. In Genesis, for example, God creates Adam by forming him from the dust of the earth, like a clay figure, and then breathing life into him. This idea reflects a world where formless matter is given shape and meaning by an external power. Because of this, many in our culture see themselves as made objects. It's why children naturally ask questions like, "How was I made?" or "Who made me?" This idea is deeply embedded in Western thinking, but isn't universal. For instance, a Chinese child would be more likely to ask, "How did I grow?" rather than, "How was I made?" That's because the concept of making is fundamentally different from growing. When something is made, it's assembled piece by piece, like a sculptor carving stone or a potter molding clay. The process works from the outside inward, with the maker imposing their will on the material. But growing is the opposite. Growth comes from within. It starts with something simple, like a cell, and gradually develops into something more complex. It expands and evolves, blossoming in all directions at once. This process is organic and self-directed, not imposed by an external force. However, Western thought has historically leaned toward the idea of the world as something made. We've seen trees, mountains, and even living beings as constructions, much like houses or tools. This view creates a clear separation between the maker, God, and the made, the world. The ceramic model of the universe, as I call it, emerged in cultures with monarchies, where the structure of government influenced how people imagine the divine. In these cultures, God is often seen as a king, a ruler who sits on a throne, governing his creation. Phrases like King of Kings and Lord of Lords from religious texts, such as the Book of Common Prayer, reflect this view. People who see the universe this way tend to relate to God as a subject relates to a monarch, with humility, reverence, and a sense of subordination to the ultimate authority. This model shapes not only how people view God, but also how they understand their place in the world. It's fascinating, and a bit strange, that in a country like the United States, where we pride ourselves on being a republic, people still cling to a monarchical view of the universe. This mindset comes from ancient cultures, where the idea of respecting the Lord of the universe meant kneeling, bowing, or prostrating oneself. Why? Because historically, tyrants were the most fearful of all. A tyrant rules by control and paranoia. He keeps his back to the wall, his guards on either side, and forces people to lower themselves because he's scared they might attack him. Think about it. You don't stand face to face with a ruler in these systems because that makes you a potential threat. Tyrants fear everyone because their rule is built on crime and power, and they know it. The ones who fail to dominate end up in jail, while the biggest crook rises to the top and rules. This fear-based structure carries into our architecture and rituals, especially in religion. Take the design of a Catholic church. Traditionally, the altar is at the far end, against the wall like a throne. The priest acts like the king's closest advisor, facing the throne of God. People kneel before it just as subjects kneel before a king. Even the word basilica comes from the Greek word basileus, meaning king. The whole setup reflects the court rituals of Byzantium, emphasizing God as a ruler over his subjects. Protestant churches are similar but lean more on judicial symbolism. The church's furniture resembles a courtroom. The pulpit stands where the judge presides, and pews resemble jury boxes. Even the minister's black robe mirrors the judge's attire. The congregation sits quietly, observing, much like people in a courtroom. Both Catholic and Protestant churches are shaped by these political images of the universe, either as a monarchy or a courtroom. They create a cosmic hierarchy where God is either a king or a judge, demanding respect and obedience. But here's the problem. Applying these old political images to the entire universe doesn't really work anymore. Science has outgrown the simple ideas of matter and spirit as separate things. Early physicists asked, what is matter? They thought they could find a fundamental substance that makes up everything. But the more they searched, the more they realized they couldn't pin it down. Instead of finding a solid stuff, they found patterns, behaviors, and forms. Look at a stone, for instance. At first glance, it seems like a solid block of material. But put it under a microscope, and you see smaller structures. Tiny crystals. Look closer, and those crystals are made of molecules. Zoom in even more, and the molecules are made of atoms. Keep going, and you find subatomic particles, electrons, protons, neutrons, and even those break down into smaller particles, like quarks and beyond. What physicists discovered is that matter isn't a thing in itself. It's a pattern of activity. It's about relationships, forms, and behaviors, not some solid, unchanging stuff. So this old idea of the universe as a monarchy, with a ruler sitting above all, or even as a courtroom governed by laws, feels outdated when we think about how the universe really works. Life and the cosmos aren't static or hierarchical. They're dynamic, interconnected, and ever-changing. This shift in understanding challenges those ancient images we've inherited and forces us to think differently about the nature of existence. You never truly get to the basic stuff because, quite simply, it doesn't exist in the way we imagine. The idea of stuff is just a word we use to describe the world when we're looking at it through an unfocused lens. Think about how things appear blurry and undefined when your eyes are out of focus. That's the essence of stuff. It's this idea of some undifferentiated goo. But when you sharpen your focus, patterns and forms start to emerge. However, the closer you zoom in, like with a microscope, you get fussy again before the details become clear. This constant cycle of fussiness followed by clarity tricks us into thinking there's some kind of underlying stuff beneath it all. But when we see clearly, all we find is form, structure, and relationships. Patterns. We never find this mystical substance that supposedly forms the essence of everything. And frankly, we don't need to. Self-organizing, self-moving, and endlessly intricate. But the trouble is, our everyday thinking hasn't caught up with this view yet. Historically, the old ceramic model of the universe, where the world was seen as shaped by a divine potter, started to break down over time. That gave rise to what I call the fully automatic model. This model emerged with the rise of Western science, which still drew from the religious idea that the universe runs on laws. These laws, much like those laid out by a potter or architect, were thought to govern everything. In Christianity, for example, these laws were tied to the concept of the Logos, or divine reason, which was embodied in Jesus Christ. The idea was that everything in nature followed this divine law, as though the universe was running on tracks like a tram or train, following a predetermined plan. Patterns alone are enough to describe reality. There's no need to imagine some inert, lifeless material waiting for an external force to shape it. The world isn't like clay that needs a potter. Modern physics shows us a different picture entirely. The universe isn't made of stuff at all. It's made of patterns, energy, and movement. It's like a dance. But by the 18th century, people started questioning this. Philosophers and scientists began to wonder whether there really was a lawmaker or an architect behind it all. They realized something critical. You don't need the idea of God to make predictions about the world. Science, at its core, is about observing the past and using it to predict the future. It's essentially a form of prophecy. But to make accurate predictions, you don't need to believe in a divine being controlling everything. Saying God is behind it all doesn't actually change what's going to happen or help explain how things work. In other words, science found that the concept of God, as traditionally understood, was unnecessary for understanding or predicting the natural world. The universe doesn't need a designer or external force to make it function. Its patterns and behaviors unfold on their own, and we can study and describe them without invoking any supernatural explanations. This shift marked a major turning point in how people understood the world, moving away from ancient ideas of divine control to a more self-sufficient, interconnected view of reality. So what happened was that they ditched the idea of a divine lawmaker but clung to the idea of law. Except, now it wasn't a divine command, but simply the observable regularities in nature. They still called it law, even though it wasn't law in the usual sense. It was just patterns, order, and regularities that could be studied and predicted. And with this shift, the image of the universe transformed into a mechanism, something functioning like clockwork, governed by predictable mechanical principles. Newton's entire view of the universe was built on this mechanical model. He imagined atoms as billiard balls, bouncing around and colliding with one another. Everything, people, animals, nature, was seen as a vast, complex arrangement of these billiard balls set in motion and reacting to one another in a predictable mechanical way. Human behavior, in this view, was just an intricate chain reaction, cause and effect on a grand scale. Then came the 19th century, with its emphasis on energy. Scientists like Ernst Haeckel and T.H. Huxley reduced the universe to blind energy, an unintelligent, aimless force driving everything. Freud paralleled this in psychology with his concept of libido, a primal blind sexual energy. According to these views, everything we hold dear, our values, cultures, languages, emotions, was just an accidental byproduct of this blind energy. It wasn't planned or purposeful. It was simply a fluke. Think of it like this. Imagine 1,000 monkeys typing on 1,000 typewriters for millions of years. Eventually, they might type out the Encyclopedia Britannica. That's us, an accident of nature's exuberance. But just as those monkeys would immediately relapse into nonsense after typing the encyclopedia, so too would nature return to chaos if left unchecked. This worldview painted humanity as a fragile anomaly, constantly at risk of being swallowed back into the meaningless churn of the cosmos. And what does that lead to? A mindset where humanity is at war with nature. If the universe is blind and unintelligent, and we're these rare, accidental beings with values and meaning, then we have to fight to preserve our way of life. We can't trust nature. It's chaotic, indifferent, and will turn us back into nothingness the moment we let our guard down. So we build a culture around the idea of conquest. The conquest of space, the conquest of nature, the conquest of mountains like Everest. We impose our will on the world as if we're something separate and superior to it. The rocket and the bulldozer become the ultimate symbols of this mindset. The rocket represents our aggressive push to conquer space. And let's be honest, it's also a not-so-subtle compensation for insecurity, especially for the archetypal male defined by aggression and dominance. The bulldozer, on the other hand, represents our war with the earth itself, reshaping it to fit our needs and desires, regardless of the consequences. But here's the irony. We're already in space. We're part of it. The Earth floats in the cosmos. We live and breathe in the middle of this vast, interconnected system. If we were more sensitive, if we let go of our obsession with control and domination, we might actually experience a universe as it is, rather than as something to conquer. We already have the tools. Telescopes, radio astronomy, all kinds of instruments that let us sense the vastness of space. But instead of tuning in, we focus on forcing our way out. Sensitivity, unfortunately, isn't a prized quality, especially in cultures like the United States, where masculinity is so often equated with aggression. In this aggressive mindset, we've lost the ability to see ourselves as part of the whole. Instead, we treat the universe as an opponent, something to dominate, reshape, and control, when, in reality, we're already embedded in its dance. You see, the real issue is that deep down, many of us feel insecure about who we are. We doubt if we're enough, so we overcompensate. We put on this big act, trying to prove our toughness, our dominance. But that's just fear in disguise. If you truly have what it takes, if you're secure in yourself, you don't need to put on a show. You don't need to dominate or beat nature into submission. That hostility toward nature, it's unnecessary and honestly misguided. Why fight nature when you are nature? You didn't drop into this world like a foreign object. You grew out of it, just like an apple grows out of a tree. The apple tree doesn't make apples, it apples. That's what it does. In the same way, the universe doesn't contain people, it peoples. You are as natural to the universe as waves are to the ocean, as clouds are to the sky. You are a symptom of this universe, just like a leaf is a symptom of a tree. You're not separate from it. You're an expression of it. But here's the catch. We've been conditioned by two major myths, the ceramic model and the fully automatic model, to believe we're somehow separate. These myths teach us that we don't belong. We think we're outsiders in this world, dropped into it like strangers. And that belief, it shapes everything about how we live. Look at our language. We say, I came into this world, as if we were imported from somewhere else. No, you didn't come into the world. You came out of it. You are the world, expressing itself as a person. But the way we talk reflects this mistaken idea that we're separate. We say things like face facts or encounter reality, as if life is some alien thing we're forced to deal with, rather than the very fabric of who we are. And this mindset doesn't stop at the individual level. It extends to how we see others. We walk around thinking, I'm this center of consciousness trapped inside my skin, and everything out there is the other. We look at people who seem familiar, those who look like us, act like us, share our religion or culture, and we think, okay, maybe they're people. But then we see others, those from different countries, with different skin colors, different ways of life, and we start to question their humanity. It's always easier to destroy or dominate someone when you've convinced yourself they're not fully human. That's why, throughout history, oppressors have labeled their enemies as less than people, as unpeople. This whole worldview creates hostility. It pits us against the external world. Why? Because we've bought into the myth that we're separate. We see ourselves as little islands of consciousness trapped inside bags of skin, surrounded by an alien world that's out to get us. But this idea, it's a superstition, a baseless theory that keeps us disconnected from the world, from each other, and even from ourselves. The truth is, you are not separate from the world. You're not a visitor here. You're a part of it, an intricate, inseparable expression of the whole universe. And until we embrace that truth, we'll keep living in fear, in hostility, in a constant state of otherness. But once we see through the illusion of separation, we can start to live differently, with connection, understanding, and peace. Let's flip the script a little bit and explore another perspective altogether. In the field of astronomy, there are two major theories about how the universe began: the explosion theory and the steady state theory. The steady state theory says the universe has always existed and is constantly expanding because free hydrogen in space keeps forming new galaxies. It suggests there was no real beginning, just an ongoing process. On the other hand, the explosion theory proposes that everything started with a colossal event, a Big Bang, billions of years ago that scattered all the galaxies across space. For now, let's run with this idea of the Big Bang. Imagine you take a bottle of ink, throw it against a wall and watch it splatter. In the middle, it's dense, but as it spreads out toward the edges, the droplets get smaller, finer, and form more intricate patterns. Now picture the universe like that. If the Big Bang happened, then we, sitting here as complex human beings, are way out on the fringe of that splatter. Tiny, intricate patterns far removed from the dense center of the explosion. But here's the thing. Most people define themselves as just these little patterns, these complicated curlicues on the edge of time and space. They think of themselves as separate, as isolated, as just these individual forms. What we fail to see is that we are still the Big Bang. We're not some after effect, not puppets dangling at the end of a cosmic process. We are the process itself. That primordial force, that initial explosion of energy hasn't gone anywhere. It's you. It's me. It's all of us, manifesting as a universe in motion, as life unfolding in countless forms. When I look at you, I don't just see the identity you've been taught to wear, the name, the title, the story. I see the universe itself, the original energy of existence expressing itself as you. And when I look at myself, I see the same thing. But we've been trained to think we're separate from it, that we're these little specks out on the edge of something massive and distant. That's the illusion. Here's where it gets interesting. The concept of things as separate entities? That's not reality. It's just a way of speaking. Language, especially nouns, makes us think in terms of separateness. Once a wise man asked a group of high school students, "What do you mean by a thing?" At first they gave him synonyms, an object, an entity. But that didn't get to the heart of it. Finally, a sharp young girl nailed it. She said, "A thing is a noun." Exactly. A noun isn't something that exists in nature. It's a part of speech. What we call things, separate objects, distinct events, are really just patterns of the same underlying process. There's no division in the universe, no true separateness. What we perceive as boundaries or distinctions are simply ways of organizing and describing an interconnected whole. Once you truly understand that, a lot of life's supposed problems just dissolve. You see that you've never been disconnected from the universe. because you are the universe, expressing itself as you. There are no nouns in the physical world, no separate things. The world we live in is wiggly. Look around you. Clouds, mountains, trees, people. All wiggly, flowing and undefined. But humans? We've got this obsession with straight lines, with order, with carving the world into pieces. We build square buildings, grid streets, and try to pretend that the world isn't one big, beautiful, chaotic wiggle. Here we are, sitting in a room of perfect angles, yet each of us is as wiggly as all get out. Now try to control something that wiggles. It's tough, isn't it? Ever tried to hold on to a live fish? That slippery little creature just slides right out of your hands. What do? You use a net. The net is our tool for catching the wiggle, for holding on to the squirmy, unpredictable world. And what's a net? It's a system. Something regular, something structured. You can number the holes. This many across, that many down. And once you do, you can start figuring out where each wiggle lands inside that framework. That's where our understanding of the world begins. With the net, the grid, the structure. It's how we make sense of the chaos. We break the infinite, flowing wiggle into bits and call each bit a thing or an event. We say, here's this piece, and here's that one. But guess what? Nature doesn't come pre-sliced. You don't crack open an egg and find a cut-up fryer inside. You break the chicken down after it's grown. The world doesn't show up thinged. It doesn't arrive pre-invented. You and I, we're not separate from the universe. We're not things sitting apart from it. We are as continuous with the world as a wave is with the ocean. The ocean waves, and the universe peoples. You're not a fragment of the universe. You're its expression. When I wave at you, that's the world waving, saying, "Hi, I'm here. I'm you too." But here's the thing. Our whole sense of self, our very consciousness, is built on a myth. A story that says, you're separate. You're a thing. You're a piece that was made, a part that doesn't belong to the whole. Society drills this into us from birth. We're hypnotized into believing we're these isolated little units, living inside our skins, cut off from everything else. And because we believe we're separate, we're terrified. My wave, it'll disappear someday. I'll die, and that'll be the end. How horrifying, right? That's the mythology we live by now. As Father Maskell said, we're nothing but something that happens between the maternity ward and the crematorium. That's the story most people walk around believing, whether they admit it or not. They go to church, say they believe in something greater, but deep down, they don't. They're scared stiff because they think their little piece, their tiny separate self, is all they've got. But that's the illusion. You're not just the wave. You're the ocean waving. You're not just a thing. You're the whole damn wiggle. And once you see that, really see it, the fear starts to fade. Because how can you ever lose what you are? Even Jehovah's Witnesses, the most hardcore of fundamentalists, don't really act like they believe what they preach. Sure, they're polite when they knock on your door, but if they really believed Christianity, they wouldn't just knock. They'd be in the streets screaming, panicked, and desperate to save your soul. They'd buy up full-page ads in every paper, flood every TV channel with terrifying messages, and turn the churches into centers of utter frenzy. But they don't. Why? Because even they don't truly believe what they say. They believe they should believe it. They feel obligated to act like they do. But deep down, they don't. What we really believe is the fully automatic model of the universe. That's our default setting, our common sense. We believe we're flukes. Random, isolated events, born in the maternity ward and marching straight to the crematorium. That's it. End of story. But here's the thing. There's no solid reason to think this way. It's not even scientific. It's just another myth. A story cooked up by people who wanted to feel a certain way, to play a specific game. See, the old game, the God-begotten game, started to wear thin. The idea of God as the grand architect or potter who shaped the universe was comforting for a while. It gave life a sense of purpose and made you feel important, like you mattered to some cosmic father figure. But after a while, the idea of being constantly watched, of having your every thought and action scrutinized, gets exhausting. You start feeling like, hey God, could you maybe stop hovering? Give me some space. Eventually, people got tired of the surveillance and said, you know what? I'm done. No God for me. And just like that, atheism became the new game. But ditching God comes with its own baggage. Without God, you're left feeling empty. If there's no God, then who are you? Just a machine, a product of random forces, a fleeting blip of existence with no meaning. And if you start to really believe that, it's easy to spiral. Some smart kids, like Camus said, see the only real philosophical question as whether or not to end it all. If life has no meaning, why not just check out? But let's back up. Beyond suicide, questions like who started this? Can we make it? Where does it all go? Who cleans it up? And if it's serious, are worth asking. Now, whether or not to go on is tied to a simple concept. Is the game worth the candle? Life has been playing out for billions of years. It's been going, growing, and evolving. If you're here and still breathing, it's because the game has, so far, been worth it. So why stop now? But here's the catch. If you're going to keep playing, you need a theory of the universe that makes the game worthwhile. You need a story that inspires you to wake up every morning and keep going. Otherwise, why bother? The universe, life, all of this. It's not about knowing everything or solving every mystery. It's about choosing a narrative that makes the game worth playing. Pick one that fuels you, one that gives you purpose. Because if the game isn't worth playing, what's the point? The people who came up with the fully automatic theory of the universe were running a game, plain and simple. Their message was, all you religious folks out there clinging to your big daddy in the sky, you're just soft, wishful thinkers. You want comfort? But life ain't about comfort. It's rough, it's tough, and only the hard-headed, no-nonsense types survive and thrive. This theory wasn't born out of pure intellect. It was a convenient narrative, especially when European colonizers were stomping across the globe, taking what they wanted and justifying it with, we're the pinnacle of evolution. We're tough, and you're weak. That's why we win. This narrative, life as a brute force game of survival, was a way of flattering themselves. They claimed they were the strongest because they were willing to face facts, even if it meant seeing the universe as nothing but meaningless chaos. It became an academically respectable, even fashionable way of seeing the world. Why? Because academia is often about proving how tough-minded you are, how precise, rigorous, and logical you can be. You've got to be prickly to fit in. No softness allowed. This brings us to the two kinds of philosophy, prickles and goo. Prickly people? They love precision, logic, and chopping things into neat, clear categories. Gooey people? They're all about the flow, the vague, the interconnectedness of everything. Take physics. Prickly folks believe the universe boils down to particles, tiny solid building blocks. Goo people argue it's waves, shifting, blending, hard to pin down. In philosophy, prickles champion logical positivism, while goo folks lean toward idealism. But here's the twist. Neither can exist without the other. A prickly person wouldn't know what prickles were if they didn't have goo to compare it to. And vice versa. Life isn't one or the other, it's prickly goo and gooey prickles. They're two sides of the same coin, male and female, back and front, chaos and order. They define and depend on each other. That's the secret most philosophers miss. Now, I'm not here to argue endlessly, but let's be real. If you disagree with me, that's a gift. Why? Because your disagreement sharpens my understanding of my own ideas. Without you, I don't even know what I think. So thank you for pushing back. It's part of the dance. But here's the problem with the fully automatic theory of the universe. It's a put-down. It reduces the entire cosmos to nothing more than random, unintelligent forces mindlessly colliding, not even enjoying themselves. This isn't a scientific conclusion. It's a story crafted to make certain people feel superior. By belittling the universe, they elevate themselves as the tough, logical ones who see through all the fluff. But the joke is on them, because they're playing just as much of a game as the religious folks they mock. The universe isn't just prickles, and it's not just goo. It's both. It's alive, dynamic, and endlessly creative. And the moment you see that, you realize the game of putting it down was never about truth. It was about power, control, and ego. If you subscribe to the view that the world is nothing more than a cold mechanical system, an endless series of electronic and neurological mechanisms, you've trapped yourself in a mindset of alienation. This way of thinking paints the world as a trap, a place where you're stuck in a decaying body that's bound to fall apart, where sickness, suffering, and death are inevitable. Doctors may try to help, but they're just playing a losing game. No matter what you do, you're just going to decay and die. It's a grim, depressing scenario. And if this is how you view the world, why bother continuing? You might as well end it all now. The only reasons you might keep going are fear of eternal damnation or a sense of duty to your children, but that's just perpetuating the same cycle. You continue supporting them, and all you're teaching them is to live in fear, to drag themselves through life, afraid to end it, but never truly enjoying it. They'll repeat the same patterns with their own kids. And it just keeps going, generation after generation. This is the mindset that the fully automatic model of the universe fosters. Alienation, despair, and an understanding that life is a grim, mechanistic process. But here's the truth. It's a myth. It's no more grounded in reality than the traditional idea of a god on a golden throne. It has no more truth behind it. It's just a story we tell ourselves because we've been conditioned to believe it. Now, let's be clear about something. If there is intelligence, love, beauty, or anything worth calling good in this universe, you'll find it in human beings. We, as people, are the bearers of these qualities. And if they exist in us, that's not an accident. It's a symptom of the greater scheme of things. Just as apples are a symptom of the apple tree, or roses are a symptom of the rose bush, our existence is symptomatic of the world we live in. The earth is not just a dead rock with organisms crawling around on it. It's a living entity that grows people. Just as your skeleton is not merely a collection of bones, but a framework that sustains your entire being. The earth is part of a grander system, the solar system, which is part of the galaxy, and so on. Each layer of existence reflects the larger whole. You can't separate yourself from it. You're not just an isolated mechanical entity. You're part of something much greater, much more interconnected. When scientists describe living organisms, they don't just talk about the parts that make up the organism. They describe the behavior of the organism, because that's how you understand what it truly is. You don't just focus on the parts. You focus on what the whole thing does, and that's how you should view yourself. You are part of the scheme of things, not a separate, isolated being trapped in a mechanical world. You're part of something alive, dynamic, and interconnected. In describing a person's actions, you can't isolate what happens inside the skin. When I walk, for instance, I'm not just moving my legs in empty space. I'm walking in relationship to the room around me. The floor is involved, the air is involved. Everything around me plays a part in what I'm doing. To fully describe my walking, I must also describe the space, the environment, the territory I'm moving through. In the same way, when I'm talking to you right now, my talking can't be fully described just as an action happening within my body. It involves your presence as well. If you weren't here, I wouldn't be talking to you. You, as the listener, are as much a part of this exchange as I am. In fact, I can't really define myself without defining you, and vice versa. You and I are part of a system. As a wise rabbi once said, if I am I because you are you, and you are you because I am I, then I am not I and you are not you. In other words, our identities aren't separate. They're interdependent. We define each other. We are not isolated entities. We're backs and fronts to one another. Think of two sticks leaning against each other. They stand up because they support each other. If you take one stick away, the other falls. This is the nature of interdependence. Similarly, in the larger picture, we are all interconnected, just like the sticks or the rings in the symbol of the Holy Trinity. If you pull one ring out, the others fall apart. We are part of an interconnected system. You can't define who you are without considering others and the environment around you. We all lock together in this great web of life, and to know who we are, we have to know who each other is. This is the basis of how science views the world. Any good scientist knows that the external world is as much a part of us as our own bodies. Your skin, which you might think of as a boundary, doesn't separate you from the world. It's a bridge, a place where the external world flows into you, and you flow out into it. Think of a whirlpool in water. The whirlpool has a definite shape, but no water stays in it. The whirlpool is the action of the water, not a separate static entity. In the same way, you could say the universe is doing each one of us. We are not separate from the universe. We are part of its flow, constantly moving and changing, yet always interconnected. Just as the whirlpool is defined by the water that moves through it, we are defined by the world and the people around us. Our form, our identity, is a product of the flow of the universe. When I see you today and recognize you tomorrow, It's like recognizing a whirlpool in a stream. I'd say, "Oh, yes, I've seen that whirlpool before. It's always near so-and-so's house by the river, and it's always there." In the same way, when I meet you tomorrow, I recognize you, but you're always moving. The whole world flows through you. The cosmic rays, the food you eat, the steaks, milk, eggs, everything. Just like the stream is constantly flowing, the world is constantly flowing through you. You're not static. You're part of the ongoing movement of life. But here's the issue. We haven't been taught to see ourselves in that way. The myths and ideas that shape our culture have trained us to see ourselves as separate from the universe, not as part of it. We've been taught to think of ourselves as distinct, individual parts of the whole, confronting the universe, feeling alien to it. Our common sense doesn't teach us that we are the universe itself. We're missing the deep understanding that we are not isolated from the cosmos, but rather we are the eternal universe moving through us every moment. And the problem is urgent. If we don't shift our perspective, we'll lose our minds. If we continue to see ourselves as separate, isolated beings, we may end up collectively destroying ourselves, as we're already capable of, with weapons like hydrogen bombs. But even if we do destroy ourselves, well, life will just move on. There will be other galaxies and other possibilities, other experiments in life. Maybe they'll find a better game to play. But unless we learn to feel our oneness with the universe, we risk losing the meaning of life altogether. Thank you for listening.